Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about, as the title of this slideshow indicates, neuroscience and the biological foundations of psychology. Okay, we're going to look at the neuro basis of behavior. Now, we've heard the term neuroscience. That's the interdisciplinary field that studies how our biology basically relates to behavior, our behavior and our mental processes. Neuropsychology, psychology is very intricately related and part of the whole interdisciplinary landscape and research endeavor of neuroscience. So everything that is psychological is also biological. So all of our ideas, all of our moods, our urges, our thoughts, our behavior really have some root, okay, in what's happening biologically in our body and in our brain, okay, in particular our brain, our nervous system at any given time. So psychologists study the links between biology and behavior. Thinking of people as, using a term that we've seen, as biopsychosocial systems. Now, our nervous system, which is the seat of it all, okay, consists of neurons. Okay, these are cells, also called nerve cells, that are responsible for receiving and transmitting electrochemical information, and the information that moves along through our nervous system is what gives rise to, or what basically is the biological basis of everything we think and do. So here is a schematic drawing of a neuron, and there are billions of neurons throughout the body, mainly in the brain, okay, but also in other parts of the nervous system, the spinal cord, and into the peripheral nervous system, extending out to our muscles and our glands and our things that are outside of the nervous system. So we'll be talking ultimately about neurons that are in the brain and and throughout the nervous system. We'll call them sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons, but that's for a little bit later. Now, a neuron in general, regardless of what kind it is, okay, basically sort of looks like this, and it's composed of three main parts. The dendrites, which are these branch-like, dendrites being coming from the Latin for branches, okay, basically will receive messages in the form of chemical stimulation from other cells, from other neurons, okay, or sensory cells, okay, and pass it into the cell body, and then that information will then be pushed along and moved along through what's called the axon, okay. And the axon is what carries the neural impulse, or the action potential, which is the electrical signal that travels down the axon to the end of the axon till it gets to these terminal branches, which contain these vesicles, terminal buttons that hold chemicals, which will get released by the electricity that pushes through a neuron. Okay, notice the term myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is something that somewhat of a cover of some neurons, and it facilitates or helps speed up neural impulses. When you look at a newborn or an infant, and even babies, you'll notice that they're much gawkier than they will be as they get older. The gawky, herky-jerky kind of movements of infants have to do with the fact that many of their their nerve cells have not yet fully myelinated. Okay, that is, it's sort of a developmental process that happens as physical development continues. Okay. Now, within a neuron, communication results from an action potential, this neural impulse that I mentioned. And you can see that a little description over here. The basic neural process is going from the dendrites through the cell body and the axon down to the end. Okay. Now, one thing to notice here, which is basically a cross section of the axon. Okay. Normally, okay, at rest, a nerve cell has this polarization. Okay, there are outside of the neuron are primarily sodium ions. Okay, or ions, depending on I guess what part of the English-speaking world you're from, but we'll call them ions. Okay, sodium ions, they have a positive electrical charge, and they predominate normally outside of a neuron. Okay, and inside, so there's a positive electrical charge on the outside, and on the inside there's generally a negative electrical charge, having to do with the fact that sodium ions, normally the nerve cell is impermeable to the sodium ions, and there's a preponderance of negatively charged material, if you will, inside a neuron. Okay, a lot of potassium ions. Okay. So there's a negative charge. Okay, so this Na plus, that's a sodium ion. Okay, that's a symbol that refers to that. And notice that primarily, okay, well, this is after an action potential, but at rest there is a negative charge on the inside owing to a paucity of these sodium ions because they can't penetrate it. So keep that in mind for the moment. Okay, so here is the action potential, so that's the neural impulse. And one thing to remember is that if you think about being at a ball game or a stadium where they're doing the wave, right? It moves across the stadium. People get up, they sit down. The next group does the same thing, and that's analogous in some ways to how an action potential occurs. It's rhythmic. It's a very constant thing. There's no actual physical movement. It is basically what we're going to see, the change in malleability of the cell membrane. Okay, that occurs when an action potential or a neural impulse occurs, that moves right down out of the cell body, down the axon in this kind of constant pace. Let me go up again. I accidentally hit a button. So what really happens, okay, a wave moves down an axon, although it's made up only of ion exchanges moving in and out. So when an action potential starts, okay, what we're going to see is we're going to see a penetration at a certain point in the axon of sodium ions in, okay, and then they go out, and at the next page they go in and out, and it's a constant kind of electrical kind of impulse that moves down. Okay, to the axon terminal. So here's another schematic of it, the action potential occurring in this constant way. Okay. So let's start at the beginning again. So at rest, we basically have a at the resting potential, we have a polarized membrane. So the membrane, okay, of the neuron, okay, is impermeable to sodium ions. Okay, they can't get in. Okay, so you have like a negative charge, negative electrical charge on the inside, and a positive electrical charge on the outside of a neuron. Okay, when there is an action potential, okay, when there is this neural impulse, okay, there is a process of depolarization that occurs. Okay, sodium ions flow in. Okay, they're flowing in. So by polarization, we're positive outside, negative inside. That's polarized. That arrangement breaks down, and there is a depolarization. So it's positive on the inside now, just as it is on the outside. Okay, the sodium ions are flowing in, and as quickly as they flow in, they're pushed back out. Okay, so that's called repolarization. Okay. So the sodium ions push back out, but also coming out with them, okay, is are some of these negatively charged potassium ions. Okay, so that's an important aspect that we'll get to in just a second, in terms of what a cell can do about firing again. But just hold off on that. So we have a repolarization, and then further down it's a depolarization, repolarization, and so on, all the way to the end of the axon, at the axon terminal. Okay. So basically, so how does that whole process get started? Well, we talked about the neuron being the membrane being impermeable to sodium ions. Okay, the chemicals that are captured by the dendrites and then pushed in into the cell. Okay, basically work to make that membrane permeable, so that ions and sodium ions can get through to it. Okay, so the neuron receives signals from other neurons. It's chemicals. Okay, some of it making the cell membrane more permeable to sodium ions. So it's going to make it more likely that the neuron now fires or has this neural impulse. Some of them will actually make it less permeable, making it more difficult to fire. Okay. So you've got all this chemical stimulation going on, making the membrane more or less permeable to sodium ions, okay, until it reaches some sort of threshold, okay. That is, a certain threshold is reached so that suddenly the the membrane becomes permeable to sodium ions, and because the excitatory, these chemical messengers that are making it more permeable, we call them excitatory, outweigh the inhibitory, don't fire, make it less permeable signals by a certain amount. And that, when we reach that threshold, that's when the action potential occurs. Okay? So when the threshold is reached, the action potential starts moving. And like a gun, it either fires or it doesn't. It doesn't, more stimulation isn't going to make it fire more or less. You've just had this action potential occurs. It's all or none, and it moves in that way right down the into and through the axon to to the axon terminal. And we call it the neural impulse or the action potential. So the action potential travels down the axon from the cell body to the terminal branches. And so that is basically a signal. Okay, that action, that cell has fired. That firing, that signal is transmitted to another cell. Okay, because at the end of the axon, the axon terminal, that electrical impulse will will basically help in affording or causing the release of chemicals out of those terminal buttons, and so that signal can then be transmitted to another cell, okay, by the chemicals that the cell released as a consequence of its electrical action potential. Now, so some important qualities to review. So it's just a few milliseconds in which the interior of the neuron went from a voltage of minus 70 millivolts, okay, to about plus 40 millivolts, about half the millivoltage of the voltage of a D battery, okay, very, very quickly when this action potential occurs, okay. So we have this happening, okay, and we have this all or none quality in which that exchange, that rapid change from minus 70 to plus 40 millivolts, okay, the depolarization, the action potential moves down the axon terminal at a constant speed and size, okay. It's a very constant thing, okay. It's moving anywhere from 2 to 180 miles per hour, which is much slower than electricity moves through an electrical wire. But of course, neurons are tiny, okay, so it happens pretty quickly, okay, the action potential. Keep in mind the all or none, okay. Now, I talked about how as quickly as the action potential occurs at a point in the axon terminal and quickly ends because there's this repolarization, the sodium ions that got in are pushed out, that at the same time, okay, some of the potassium that is normally inside, negatively charged potassium, that is inside the normally inside the potassium is also positively charged. There are other things that are like chlorides and so on that are negatively charged that may keep it negative inside, but basically a lot of the potassium gets removed, okay, along with the sodium by what's called the sodium-potassium pump, okay. So basically, because there is a removal not only of the sodium ions that got in, the positively charged sodium ions that got in, but also the potassium ions are removed also, okay, briefly. We get a hyperpolarization, okay. And the hyperpolarization creates what we call a refractory period, okay? A small amount of time, okay, in which the cell is unable to fire because it's now hyperpolarized, okay? It's hypernegative inside and hyperpositive outside, okay? So there's no way that the cell can fire, okay? You know, the best analogy to the refractory period is what follows a male orgasm in sexual act, okay? Very briefly, after a male has ejaculated, it cannot the male can't again. Okay, there's this, we call it the refractory period there too. Okay, well, anyways, that's an analogy. The refractory period this hyperpolarization has a very important function. It limits the rate at which a cell can fire, a nerve cell can fire to about 300 times per second. Okay, so we can't get any we can't get we can't get like an out of control neuron just firing out of control, which would involve the create very quickly a huge seizure in the brain if that happened to lots and lots of cells. So there is a limit that's placed on how frequently a nerve cell, a neuron, can have an action potential. And then the final thing we talked about was the speed at which it occurs. It's an all or none thing, and it moves along the axon terminal at a maximum of 200 miles per hour if it's a well-myelinated neuron or axon. Okay. All right. So that's what we can call communication within neurons. Okay. You get the chemical stimulation of the dendrites, which ultimately may result in an action potential and that electrical effect. And so how do we go between neurons? Well, we saw that briefly just a few moments ago. But the communication between neurons occurs through transmission of information across a synapse. Okay, the synapse is the space between the dendrites of a receiving cell and the axon terminal of a sending cell. Okay, of a cell that's just had an action potential. Okay, so here's a schematic of a terminal button at the end of an axon, and there are many of these kind of extending out. Okay, and within a terminal button, okay, are these little vesicles which contain chemicals. Okay, those chemicals are called neurotransmitters. Okay, they're very important. And when a cell has an action potential, okay, as this electrical neural impulse occurs, when it gets to the axon terminal, when it gets to these terminal buttons, it's going to cause a release of the chemicals in these terminal buttons, a release into the synapse, okay, which is a gooey space between cells that do not directly connect with one another. And so those chemicals that are released will travel across the synapse and then are capable of stimulating, okay, the cells that are adjacent, okay, the dendrites of the cells that are adjacent, okay, and possibly creating, and with the help of all the other neurons that are also communicating in this web, okay, a neural impulse in a receiving cell, okay. So that's how between neuron communication occurs. And here's another schematic of the idea that I just threw out there. Okay. And so you can see the synapse, and this is the receptor sites on the receiving neuron, and the neurotransmitters traveling across the synapse that have been released by the sending neuron. Okay. So receiving neurons, electron microscope picture, and you can see the complex web. Receiving neurons receive multiple messages from other neurons. Okay, and these multiple messages determine if an action potential occurs or not. So remember from previously that we talked about excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters or chemical connections between cells. Okay, so basically, there are some neurotransmitters that are released, okay, that in conjunction with that nerve cell really create an excitatory synapse. That is, they make it more likely the cell is going to fire, okay. And inhibitory synapses are when the chemical that is released actually makes the cell of the receiving neuron less permeable, okay, and therefore inhibits the possibility of an action potential or a neural impulse, okay. So, like the limits placed by the refractory period, this helps prevent runaway discharge of the nervous system, like in a massive epileptic seizure. Okay, so um, so basically, remember that it's all or none. Okay, how is stimulus strength communicated? Well, one way, again, is to whether or not it's an excitatory and inhibitory synapse. Get to a certain threshold point, it's going to fire. It's all or none, okay? But depending on the ratio or the amount of excitatory versus inhibitory, that would affect um, whether or not it fires. So stimulus strength is communicated by what kinds of uh, uh, things that, what kinds of synapses are involved in the whole exchange. And then strength is signaled in two ways, okay? One, a strong stimulus will cause a neuron to fire more frequently, okay? A strong excitatory kind of stimulus, okay? And a strong stimulus will also cause more neurons to fire, okay? So, so we ask the question, if there's just one level of intensity because it's all or none, so a good way to remember this is if the signal has only one level of intensity, well, why does a punch, okay, stimulating the same sensory neurons, say in your shoulder, okay, hurt or is felt more than a tap, okay? Is it because it created stronger neural impulses? No, neural impulses are all or none, and they're all of a constant strength, okay? It's because in the case of the punch, more neurons are firing, okay? As opposed to the tap, which is going to stimulate fewer neurons firing, okay? Okay. Here's the electron microscope picture. The axon terminals of sending neurons are almost completely covering the cell body of a receiving neuron. Okay. So this is a bit of a review. Okay. We talked about the synapse. It's the junction between the axon tip of the sending neuron, the axon terminal, the terminal button, and the dendrite or cell body of the receiving neuron. Okay. And the synapse is also known as the synaptic junction or the synaptic gap. Okay. So we've seen this before. Now, neurotransmitters. So those are the chemicals. That's what we call the chemicals that get released when there's an action potential. Okay. And it's also the case, so you might say, well, why a neuron? Okay, so a neuron fires, it releases some of its chemicals. Isn't it eventually going to run out of these little vesicles that that contain the neurotransmitters, or will the neurotransmitters be depleted? Well, actually not, okay, because there's an important process known as reuptake, Okay, so after the neurotransmitters stimulate the receptors on the receiving neuron, the chemicals are taken back up into the sending neuron to be used again. Okay, so there's this reuptake process. So as quickly as a cell fires and its chemicals work on the next cell, okay, to possibly cause an action potential, depending on whether it's excitatory, inhibitory, and whether it reaches a threshold. Those chemicals that were released get reuptaken, put back into, okay, they move back into the axon from which they were, the cell from which they were released. So this is a summary page that you can that can be useful to you. I think it may be represented almost exactly this way in your textbook, where we see, I won't go through it all again, but we have the electrical impulses, okay, and how that works. We have the action potential being released, being occurring, stimulating the release, okay, into the next cell. Then we have, for that particular cell that released it, a reuptake process taking place. So this is a good page to keep in mind as a review, keep available as a review of this whole process. Now, neurotransmitters, how do they influence behavior? So neurotransmitters, they travel in their designated pathways, and they have their own pathways in the brain, and they may influence specific behaviors and emotions. So we'll actually look at a list of some of them in just a moment, but here's a couple of them. Acetylcholine, okay, ACH, okay, which is a neurotransmitter which we see a concentration of in parts of the brain that are tied in with motor and muscle actions, okay, as well as with learning and memory, okay. That's a neurotransmitter. Endorphins are basically neurotransmitters that are released in response to pain and to exercise, okay. They're opiates, they're natural opiates, okay. And then there are, as we'll see, that various kinds of drugs that act on our behavior and our mental state, okay, they work because they affect the brain chemistry going on at the synapses between nerve cells. So how do drugs and other chemicals alter neurotransmission? Okay. So there are certain kinds of drugs that are called agonists that increase the action, okay, of a given neurotransmitter. Okay, so certain kinds of drugs work to make certain kinds of neurotransmitters, have a stronger effect, okay, or get released more readily, get more available. They're called agonists, okay. And antagonist drugs, okay, include molecules that inhibit or block the action of a neurotransmitter. Here's a picture of the pathways of two different neurotransmitters, very important neurotransmitters, serotonin, okay, and dopamine, okay. So each of the brain's differing chemical messengers, those are two of them, has designated pathways where it operates, okay. So it flowing through the neurons, okay, that basically follow these brain pathways. So let's look at several of the neurotransmitters, at least in brief, okay. So serotonin, okay. So serotonin is a very important neurotransmitter Well, they're all important, but this one is very important in terms of regulation of mood, regulation of hunger, of sleep, and of arousal. Okay, so for example, an undersupply of serotonin has been linked to depression. Okay, it's an excited serotonin is an excitatory neurotransmitter, or it's involved in excitatory synaptic transmission. Um, and so some antidepressant drugs will raise serotonin levels. Okay, they act as agonists. Um, and we'll see other way, and other drugs also basically make more serotonin available by out in the synapses by blocking its reuptake back into the cell. Uh, we'll see that a little bit more in a second. Okay, uh, dopamine. So let me go back to serotonin for a second. So we'll talk about SS RIs, okay, drugs like Prozac, which basically are called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, okay. In order to keep a lot of serotonin out there at the synapses available to stimulate other cells, they block the ability of neurons to absorb back into itself themselves the serotonin, keeping it out there at the synapses to influence other cells. Okay, dopamine. Okay, well, it influences movement, learning, attention, emotion. Okay, so an oversupply is linked to schizophrenia. Okay, an undersupply of dopamine is linked to tremors and the kind of decreased mobility that you see in Parkinson's disease and in ADHD. We know people have Parkinson's; they have they have a lot of tremors. They have their mobility becomes inhibited. Um, they someone who has very extreme levels of Parkinson's, they will move in a very, very stiff way, but at the same time their hands may be shaking. Um, and L-Dopa, of course, is a drug that's used to try to push more dopamine, keep more dopamine available at the synapses and available to the nervous system to help control that. Okay. ADHD, similar kind of effects, although um, the if we look at schizophrenia, for example, going back to that, it may not be a problem of so an oversupply linked to schizophrenia. That might not be due to uh, uh, reuptake blocking, but some research suggests that it's due to the fact that people who are schizophrenic have an overabundance of dopamine receptors, not just an oversupply of the dopamine itself. Okay. Uh, okay. Acetylcholine, we mentioned that. Okay, that's big in the in research and treatment discoveries related to Alzheimer's. Norepinephrine. Norepinephrine basically is a neurotransmitter that helps control alertness and arousal. And so if you have an undersupply of it, that can depress mood, and it can cause attention issues. Okay, so norepinephrine is also an excitatory kind of transmitter, and so too little of it leads to can lead to depressed moods and problems maintaining attention, as we see in ADHD. Um, GABA, okay, this is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and an undersupply is linked to seizures, tremors, insomnia. And finally, glutamate. Okay, and this is also an excitatory neurotransmitter, very much involved in memory. A lot of research we're here with glutamate in memory. So an oversupply can stimulate the brain, overstimulate the brain, can produce migraines, can produce seizures. So this is why some people avoid MSG in their Asian food, okay? Um, because that's monosodium glutamate, and sometimes if you have eaten Chinese food, um, which for which MSG is used a lot in, um, you might, not only did you enjoy the food tremendously, but you might have a little bit of an alertness, arousal buzz, and possibly get a headache after you've eaten it. Okay, so those are some of the neurotransmitters. Um, this is a little video. I'm not going to show it here, although actually I think I could, but that would be using up. But that would be using up too much of this narration. Um, but I actually have posted this under the video theater, um, and just called chemically induced hallucinations, looking at how anesthetic drugs may be related to altered states of consciousness and how that may be related to neurotransmission and things like that. So that's a nice little video to watch, and it's available for you. We saw this networks of neurons that communicate with serotonin help regulate mood, serotonin pathways, and dopamine pathways. Networks of neurons that communicate with using dopamine are involved in focusing attention and controlling movement. And so the predomination of these pathways in the brain, you can see where they are. Okay, so we've been talking about basically neural transmission through the nervous system. Okay, we talked about the nerve cell and the neuron, if you will, another name for it, and how information is communicated. Okay, through our nervous system, through this electrochemical recursive process that is going on continuously with billions, millions and billions of nerve cells at any given time. Okay. Now, somewhat parallel to the nervous system, okay, is the endocrine system, okay, which basically involves communication in our bodies, in our minds, but particularly in terms of the brain communicating to the body and vice versa, through a set of glands, okay, that secretes hormones into the bloodstream. I just want you to get the main points of the endocrine system and sort of what it is, okay? So hormones travel throughout the body. They're, essentially chemicals in the blood, okay? And they affect tissues, including the brain, okay? The master gland that influences hormone release is called the pituitary gland, okay? And we also have heard of the adrenal glands, okay, where adrenaline, which basically helps power the muscles and attention and things like that through the adrenal gland, okay? So there's an intricate feedback system, okay, which is basically centered in the brain's hypothalamus. And in our next lecture, okay, when we talk about the structures of the brain, we'll talk about the hypothalamus. But an important thing here to remember is that the hypothalamus influence the pituitary gland. Okay, its hypothalamus is highly involved um, in the regulation of emotion and motivation. Okay, and so it works. It connects up, and it's highly integrated in with the pituitary gland. So between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland is where these two systems of communication, the central nervous system and the endocrine system, kind of like work in an integrated way. This is a schematic of the endocrine system, which you can look at. Okay, and once again we can see and it sort of illustrates the interplay. Okay, between the nervous and the endocrine system. Okay. I just want you to get the main points of what the uh, of where hormones are located and where um, and how and what they regulate. Okay, in us in the body. Okay, the idea that the hypothalamus, which is a brain structure or a brain region, okay, which is really hooked in as a nervous system entity. So it's all powered by, you know, the neurotransmission that we've been talking about, action potentials and nervous system activity, the activity of our brain cells, if you will. That's the hypothalamus is basically a system, a structure that's basically part of that nervous system that we've been talking about. Um, but it controls, okay, the pituitary gland, which controls this other method of communicating across the body, which is through the bloodstream, through the hormones. Okay. All right. And so you might ask the question as we end this lecture, well, why do we need two communication systems? Why do we need neurotransmitters? Neurotransmitters, of course, has been we've talked about a lot here in this, and a little bit we've talked about hormones. Okay, why do we need both? Okay, and one way that we might look at this is that, well, neurotransmitters are much more specific. Okay, they send individual messages to individual parts of the body, if you will. Okay, so they're pretty focused in that way. Um, Hormones are much more global. Okay, they send global messages that go all over the place through the bloodstream and into the system, our whole behavioral and system in that fashion. Okay, so we've got these two parallel systems going on, one more specific, sending individual messages, if you will, about certain kinds of behaviors and certain structures of the body, and hormones, which are much more global. And with that final thought in mind, I will leave you to it and end this slideshow. Stay tuned in the near future for another one when we'll talk more about the nervous system and talk about brain structures. Here we've been talking about at a micro level the basic unit of the nervous system. Mostly we've been talking about, namely the neuron. And next we're going to talk about in the future how those billions of neurons are comprise the many brain and nervous system structures that we have. Okay.